Welcome to The Learning Hack, a podcast about the people and technologies that are creating the future of learning. I'm John Helmer.
Now guess what? Learning is cool. Learning is cool. Learning is cool.
Nick Shackleton-Jones is a controversial figure in learning, but a hugely influential one, so I'm really pleased to have him on the podcast. Earlier in the year, his book How People Learn was published by Kogan Page, and he's been on a sort of book tour ever since, meaning that a few other podcasts have featured him already. But I wanted to get to the heart of what drove him to write the book. There's passion there, there's anger, and since his effective context theory is all about tapping into people's deep-rooted concerns, I wanted to tap into his deep-rooted concerns, and I think we did that in the interview. As well as the book, we cover education, what's wrong and right with instructional design, current L&D hot buttons like learner experience and learning in the flow of work, and whether he thinks his ideas are really getting across or not. Hope you enjoy it.
For the benefit of those who haven't read it yet, can you summarise what your book, How People Learn, is all about?
It's been very interesting to me to learn what different people think it's about. As the author, I imagine that you feel like you're entitled to say what it's about, but the reality is a book gets interpreted by different people in different ways. And that's all part of the process, understanding that that's how it works. So I'll answer your question as directly as I can. It's 3 books. There's the book that the publishers wanted me to write, which is Designing Education and Training That Works to Improve Performance, which is the subtitle. Yep. And that's very practical. And it's all about how to kind of fix education and training. And so there's lots in there about things like shifting from courses to resources, designing experiences, user-centered design, 5DI, even things like, when to use video and when not to use video, and stuff around education and why it's broken and how we should fix it. That's one level of the book. You can imagine the 3 books sort of stacked, almost like floors in a department store. So if you go up a floor, it's the book that I wanted to write, which is a book about how people learn. The working title for it was the first book about learning. And that was because I wanted to sort of differentiate it from books which you can buy called How People Learn, which basically just kind of summarise a bunch of their kind of favourite research. Whereas what I was trying to introduce was the first kind of general theory of learning, which is what I've tried to do in the book. So the book I wanted to write was really about kind of how people learn and to introduce a new way of thinking about that. And then there's a book that emerged above it, which is that in the course of understanding how people learn, you end up understanding how thinking works. So there's a book on the 3rd floor, which is kind of the nature of thought. My background is a philosopher, and it's something that's kind of bugged me all my life. And so what I've observed is people go into this kind of department store, and most of them kind of scoot around on the 1st floor. A couple of people have popped their heads up to the 2nd floor, but they almost kind of can't believe what they're seeing, and they sort of make it sort of anxious noises, and then they head back down to the 1st floor. And if I can be, I suppose, slightly self-indulgent, I suspect that the rest of my life will be spent on that 3rd floor, kind of staring expectantly, I guess, at the elevator, and hoping that it will ping, at some point. So that's what the book is about. It's about 3 things.
Yeah, and I think the ambition of it is what really kind of caught my attention. And it's interesting you talk about the subtitle coming from the publishers, because I know on the Good Practice podcast they suggested alternative subtitles. There was a point when I thought the subtitle of this ought to be where Plato, Aristotle, Nietzsche, Skinner and the rest of them all went wrong, because it did seem to me, as I was reading something that just seemed to overturn almost everything that we thought we knew about learning, and I began to think, well, what are the bases of these? If you're kind of overturning those authorities, what authorities are you putting in its place?
It's really delightful to me that you spotted that, because almost nobody does. And those people who do spot it, who spot even things short of that, ambition short of that, namely, changing what we think about learning, their reaction is almost always the same, which is you're not entitled to do that. And it struck me as a really interesting thing about people, that they react in that way. It's, no, you're not entitled. And I think there's always a tendency to become defensive, but it does seem strange to me that people would think that somehow innovation would come from the establishment, that somehow the person who would, innovate in thinking around things like learning would be somebody from kind of academia, which is, to my mind at least, all about kind of conventions and establishment. And so I think it is ambitious. It's also, I would have to say, it's not driven by, on my part, kind of arrogance. I think that's the other thing, is they think, oh, who's this terribly arrogant chap? It's rather something that I felt I'm duty bound to say. I did philosophy and psychology. I did a couple of degrees in philosophy and psychology. So I started with the premise that there's no point in doing anything in life unless you can first figure out what matters and what things are for. So I almost sort of lived my life backwards. So for me, it was tremendously important. It has always been tremendously important since I was a teenager, to get to the bottom of things. And so this isn't just something that's come out of nowhere. It's something that's grown on me over the years. So yes, I do take issue all the way back to Plato. I take issue, as in the book, with Descartes. I'm super critical of Wittgenstein, who is clearly a lot smarter than me, but I think basically, like many smart people, was hampered by the conventions and assumptions that were built into his thinking. You look at Descartes. Descartes spends a significant part of his brilliant career trying to figure out how to prove the existence of God. And at the end of it, he says, well, God by definition is perfect, and if he didn't exist, that would be an imperfection, so therefore he exists. That's it. And so, it's like smart people can nevertheless be completely undermined by sort of weird assumptions and conventions that are built into their thinking. So thanks for remarking on that. It's not something I've had an opportunity to talk about on any other kind of forum. So yeah, you're right.
Yeah. One thing I was wondering about was, okay, what you're basically saying is you can't learn anything unless you care about it. If we want to help people learn stuff, we have to find out what they care about. Is it a problem for you that we don't know what we don't know? In other words, as you enter a knowledge field, you don't care about any of it. You don't know why you're learning about Oxbow Lakes in geography. I still don't know why I learned that. I don't know why it stuck in my mind so much. But take an example from maths. I once gave a presentation to a board of marketing results, and I cocked up the way I calculated percentages. And I had to go back a couple of weeks and say, sorry, I got it wrong. Now, the results are actually better than I'd said first time round, but I'd massively lost credibility with these people because I got the sums wrong.
Yeah.
When I first studied percentages at school, I was thinking, I want to be a writer when I grow up. I don't care about this stuff. I don't care about percentages. The thing really didn't mean much to me. It's probably why I'd messed up my maths so much. But when you first kind of go to school, you are taught an awful lot of stuff that you just fundamentally don't care about.
I actually really like that example. I think it illustrates quite nicely exactly what I'm talking about. And what I mean by that is the effective context model says that one care or concern, the reason I use concern is because it's more technical sounding, but there isn't really a word to describe what I'm talking about really very well. If I use the word emotion, people just think kind of happy, sad, all that kind of stuff. And this is part of the problem. Our language stems from our philosophical assumptions, and so for the new ideas we don't have words. But the new cares are built on the old, is the premise of the effective context. So you start out, like any creature, with a set of what Damasio calls homeostatic, kind of inbuilt concerns. You don't like cold, you don't like hot, blah, blah, blah. And all of your learning then builds on those. So what sorts of cares do human beings have that are building blocks for learning? Well, we know that there comes a certain point in their existence, and other creatures, where they have what's called a theory of mind. They become aware of the thoughts of others. And it seems, there's some debate about mirror neurons, but we are sensitive to what other people think of us. And people like Jaak Panksepp look at this in lobsters. Because even lobsters are status-driven creatures. And remarkably, this is hard-coded in that if they lose status, their posture changes, their levels of neurotransmitters change. And human beings are certainly designed in this way to care about what other people think of them because they're social creatures. And the interesting thing is that builds into clothing choices. People start to worry about what to wear. and they worry about what to wear because they're worried about what people will think of them and the impact that will have, and that has a measurable impact on a biological level in terms of neurotransmitters. It's fascinating. So your example, which I'm going to pick up, is I think a lovely illustration of that, because that is the problem with education at its core, is we don't relate the content to what matters to people. We sit somebody in a classroom, we've got a standard curriculum, and we say, you're going to hear about all this stuff, and it's never occurred to us that that information will be lost unless we're relating it to those concerns, unless we're building. And so what I suggest in the book is that one of the first things you should do in any educational process, and this is what we do with corporate learning, is map the concerns of the audience. Otherwise you've got no chance of any of this stuff sticking. And 2 points on that. There is a reasonable body of research to show that where you can make education more relevant to people, you get better outcomes. So there is some support for that. And the second thing is, you might almost challenge me at that point and say, well, let me go the other way then, Nick. So if that's true, how is it that people manage to remember anything at all? To which the answer is, what do we do to them? We frighten them. What do we frighten them with? We frighten them with tests. Why are tests frightening? Because we care about what our parents think of us, and we know that in many cases if we get test scores which are bad, our parents would be disappointed, and disappointed is a big emotional word, and then the implication of that would be that you get better educational outcomes from students whose parents really cared about education and test performance. Do we see this? Yes, we do. So that's how it all kind of fits together rather neatly, I think.
So if we're not just dealing with fear, and nowadays you can't threaten people, I'm old enough to have grown up in an education system where there was 6 of the best, and various types of browbeating and even bullying to get you in the right state of mind for learning. If we're not going to deal on the fear level, we have to have pull rather than push. It seemed to me the implication of what you're saying in the book is that education should really just be about designing experiences for people.
Yeah.
Because at the moment we're just kind of trying to beat checklists into them, which you call resources. And I remember my history lessons were a list of resources, a list of dates and things which you could cite for the exams. So what would we have if we didn't have that? Would school just be a series of experiences? I can remember some experiences from school, which were certainly learning ones, but how to smoke, smoke without getting caught.
Smoke without getting caught, that's a great one.
Find a bush, all the stuff with the bike sheds. Perhaps better draw a line under that.
But that would be a great podcast, the Bike Sheds podcast. I mean, we should all spend time sharing stories about what we learn behind the bike.
Well, it's interesting as a consultant, I often have to go into companies and find out where the beating heart of that organisation is, because you're working on branding and stuff like that. And it hampers me now that I no longer smoke, because the place to find out was always in the little group of smokers at the back.
Yeah.
And that's a behaviour that for me goes back to school. All the cool kids were in the bushes smoking.
Yeah.
And that's how you found what was really going on.
And that's a fascinating topic in its own right. I will come back to your question, but Roger Shank said something similar many years ago about learning courses, and why does a learning course have to be 2 days? And we'll sometimes say to a client, basically it's got a minimum, it's got to be 2 days. Well, because the evening is when all the learning really gets done, and people get together at the bar and they swap stories and they kind of bond over stuff, and often the feedback reflects that the networking, in quotes, was the bit that people benefit from most. But I find that really difficult, because whilst that's probably true, it's quite an exclusive process. So I'm basically a single parent now, and so there are lots of evening events and stuff that I can't participate in. And I think in a world where we're trying to be more inclusive, recognition of that is actually quite important. If only we could actually build those kinds of dynamics into the structure of kind of sessions and decision making and so on themselves, rather than pushing them to the fringe in the way that kind of education does. But your question was about, it doesn't mean that all school has to be experiences. No, I'm glad you asked that. I mean, be absolutely clear on that, because the point is rather that if somebody really cares about something, you don't need an experience. If somebody really cares about something, they will Google. So a small child might be, and I use the Minecraft example, I quite like it because I'm familiar with it, they might love that. they've fallen in love with Minecraft, and you can just buy them an encyclopedia, and they will crave an encyclopedia, which is a kind of bizarre thing in its own right. I mean, one of these game manuals, and these are great, thick, very information dense things, and they will plough through that and they will consume it at a voracious rate. My point about experiences is that at the beginning of your life, you have, as I suggested, this fairly sort of general, sense of different things that matter to you, but it's not very refined. So it's really important that schools expose us to lots of different variations of those experiences and environments, so that you can begin to kind of really focus and refine what you care about. So I don't think, for example, my daughter really knows what she wants to do yet. I mean, my youngest daughter, at least, she's only 10. But I love the fact that she came home from school yesterday and said, basically we had a budget of 5 million and we had to design a theme park. And she said, and I was getting really frustrated and I found it really anxious, that you have to, not only do you have to buy this ride, but you have to think about the maintenance and all this kind of stuff. And I said, well, if you really hated that experience, then you've learned something valuable, which is, because that's basically like a project manager or whatever.
Yeah.
If you really don't enjoy that, then probably that's not the kind of thing that you should look to do.
You're not going to be a project manager.
But somebody else might love
probably
it.
be a learning designer.
Yeah. So I think experiences. Yeah. Yes. I think experiences play a vital role, and they are really important early on. But
Yeah.
I'm absolutely not saying that all that schools should do is provide experiences, and all of the resources and support for people who've discovered something they care about.
Okay, so on the subject of learning designers and learning design, you're quite dismissive about instructional design in the book. I was very struck the other day by hearing Leonard Hooks, I think, not sure how to pronounce his name, sorry Leonard if you're listening, from the Cass Business School talking about instructional design and waving the flag for it and saying that a lot of the discoveries that are coming out now about neuroscience, he says, are already there in the literature. And it's just that people think the instructional design literature is a load of bunk because so much of it has been disproved, but actually there are still riches there. And I just wondered, is there any of instructional design you feel should be saved from Room 101, as it were, or is the whole thing just a load of claptrap?
Yes, I am very critical, but I ought to perhaps soften that a little bit. By claptrap, I don't mean that it's some of it is bunk, but some of it is just accurate but unhelpful. So anybody who's done instructional design, as I have, will know that there's a good research body. How dare you tell me it's bunk? The problem is that the research is not underpinned by a theory of learning, and that can be almost as problematic as it being bunk. So as an example, I came across a neuroscience study that showed that citrus fruits improve learning. So now we have lemons as part of the instructional design playbook, and you could quite legitimately say, as an instructional designer, I think everybody on this course is going to have their very own lemon, and here's a piece of research that shows it. And the problem is that, as I say, without this underpinning theory, people don't realise this, that the research doesn't somehow all cohere into, you don't keep on researching and all of a sudden it comes into focus. The whole point of research is to support or reject a theory, and that's really where you should start, and it's really troubling, and I'll try and explain why. I mean, I see my thinking on this is going through probably three phases: a kind of a pre-adolescent phase, an adolescent phase, and then an adult phase. The pre-adolescent phase was when I was teaching this stuff in my early 20s, and I was teaching learning theory to people who were learning about learning theory, and I was super enthusiastic because I was learning about all these different things, and when you teach something you have to, and reading all these papers and thinking, look, you could transform the world, if we just applied some of this stuff, working memory model and stuff to what we're doing. And then I left that kind of teaching job and went into a role where I had a chance to put it into practice. And what I learned, I talk about this in the book, is it basically doesn't work. It doesn't really make any difference. It's fiddling at the fringes of somebody's experience. And then you go through this kind of adolescent phase where you feel deeply disenchanted with it all, and you're massively skeptical, and you just say, well, that's all, I'm allowed to say bullshit on this, but, to everybody, about everything. And then I kind of came out of that probably in my sort of 40s and started really working towards a model where I could explain it and I could fit the pieces in, which is effective context model. So I see different people at those different phases. I still recognise and respect the burst of enthusiasm that somebody has for things. Let's say take working memory model, for example.
Yeah.
It's kind of good in the sense that, look, if you've understood the working memory, Baddeley and Hitch's working memory model, you know that the acoustic loop is used for kind of processing written speech as well as acoustic information,
Yeah.
and that will tell you, don't create e-learning modules where you've got some text on the screen and a voiceover, or don't stand up in front of people and read out what is on the slide, because either people are reading what's on the slide themselves or they're listening to you, but they cannot be doing the same thing at the same time. And you might think, well, there's a good example, but the problem is that doesn't get you anywhere unless you understand that really what's governing learning underneath that is people's concern, whether or not this stuff matters to them.
Yeah.
And so, as I say, all of the ID stuff will just allow you to kind of tinker at the fringe and may actually push you in the wrong direction unless fundamentally you understand how people are learning.
I just wanted to ask you as well about, while you're on the subject of learning design, a while ago, a few years back, you said you no longer hired people with a learning background because it took you a year to beat all that rubbish out of them or whatever. I'm sure you don't kind of have those kind of methods in your management leadership style.
It would be ironic if I did, yeah.
But is that still your view? I mean, do you still tend to recruit from digital marketing?
Absolutely. I'm going to name names. I'm going to outdo you. So, as an example, when I was at BP, I hired a lady called Gemma Critchley, who is making waves, I think, now in L&D.
Yeah.
But she was working in digital marketing in Monsoon at the time. And this was her first foray into learning. And I saw enormous potential in that because she understood not just some of the technology, but she could, bring across some of the thinking in marketing, I think, which is all about kind of behaviour change and measurement of that and kind of strategies for doing it, which hasn't been hampered by kind of educational convention the way that we have. And we wouldn't have to do that deconditioning process. And I'll just pick up on that point because you hurt people when you decondition. It's not even as simple as saying, that's all rubbish, leave it at the door. If somebody has, gained qualifications in instructional design, certificates and whatever, it's not as simple as saying, just forget all that. That's become part of their sense of who they are. And so to kind of take all that away is almost kind of wanton act of kind of violence almost. So it's not just for my sake, but also it's just too painful, I think, to sometimes strip all that away from people, and I don't want to do it. I'd rather take somebody with a different set of assumptions and ideas and kind of introduce them to the world of learning. Quite often they'll bring a new perspective, and that's really helpful.
One of the things I find now is coming in from my world of marketing, if you like, into L&D is this idea about learner experience, that there's much more focus now on people-centered design. Do you think that relates in any useful way to your ideas about creating experiences versus resources, or is it just another piece of L&D hype?
Yes and no. I think learning experiences, what I really like about learning experience and learning experience design is the idea that we're actually going to focus on what the learner experiences. I'll put this in very practical terms. When I was at BP, nobody had ever talked, to people actually doing real jobs on the front line, so to speak. Instead, we had all these kind of academies. But we did this radical thing of actually talking to people who are working in a refinery and getting their perspective on, what training was there to do. And to them, it's like rain or hail. It's just this constant, stuff that it makes the job more difficult. It's raining down on them from the HR folk. It's like, you've got to do another compliance thing. That's not exclusively people's experience of L&D, but I think the insight that we brought to that organisation and are now bringing to kind of others is, why don't you actually start, instead of starting with the systems and the content and saying, we are going to use this system to push out all this content and people actually understand what somebody's experience is at a quite granular level. Like, you come to work, you're trying to do this, you're struggling with this, and then this is what you're trying to achieve at the end of the day. And then actually develop learning and other stuff which kind of supports them in doing that thing, and that's how you achieve business alignment, by helping people to do their jobs. And that, I think, is an idea that sort of bubbled up through development, and through the idea that user experience is where you should focus, not just on the kind of the back end of the systems. What I don't like about it is we should just be talking about people's experience, not their learning experience, because actually sometimes the best way to improve somebody's experience is through reducing or eliminating learning. And a very simple example with GPS, which is massively improved, because I'm terrible. I'm like Mr. Magoo trying to get from one place to another. So being able to kind of get in the car, punch in the postcode, and off you go, massively improves my experience. But it's been by reducing my need to learn. So I think that it's a little bit like training analysis. There's a real risk that we build the solution into the problem statement. And so I think we should just be looking at improving people's experience at work, and I certainly think learning can play a role in that.
That brings us to another kind of buzz phrase at the moment, which is learning in the flow of work, which you hear more and more. I don't want to second guess what you say about this, but I think reading the book, you probably say that, well, it's, you just don't have time to do any learning in the flow of work. What you're talking about is checklists and so on.
No, I think there's a good sense of learning in the flow of work and a bad sense. And so you will have seen me kind of battling things like micro-learning, which I think is the bad sense of it, and promoting the good sense, which is performance support. And let me just kind of draw the distinction there. So I think almost all learning happens in the flow of work, which is kind of jargon. I think that's what 70-20-10 and other more reliable bits of research is really about, that the vast majority of learning is happening as we're doing stuff. But I think what that means is that learning is driven by challenges. So I'll give an example. I bought a coffee this morning. There was a trainee in Starbucks, and the lady standing in front of him wanted a raspberry muffin and a blueberry muffin, and he clearly didn't know the distinction, so he got the wrong ones out, and she yelled at him, which is quite an emotional experience, and he went back and did it again and got the right ones out, and that was, I was watching him learning in the flow of work. I think that the way that it's been misinterpreted is we should force people to learn as they're working. So let's take all of the content that we couldn't get them to consume as lectures because it was too costly, and we couldn't get them to consume as e-learning because they hated it. And let's chop it up into ever small pieces so that if they've got an odd 2 minutes, while they're not doing something else, then they can do this module. And I think that's a terrible idea.
Mr. Clippy.
Yeah.
And
Mr.
the thing
Clippy,
happened in marketing with Seth Godin came up with the phrase, let's not do interruption marketing. Do you think learning flow work, there's a kind of danger that we end up with interruption learning?
I think it's that we're not the locus of control. It's not us doing learning to people, that's the problem. So I could create a bunch of resources. The underground map is the one that I've beaten to death as an example. But their aim is just to make your life better. If you learn from them, if you choose to memorize some of those things, if it helps you learn, that's entirely up to you. But it might also just be a resource that you use. We don't control that. People's learning is something that's up to them. And so we can put things in place, experiences, or we can put mini experiences, challenges, let's say, or we can put resources in place. But whether or not they cause learning is up to the individual. Their objective, though, should simply be, to enable people to have a better experience and to perform better within the work.
Tell me everything you saw. What you think it means.
There's a degree of exasperation, I think, in the book. It's probably fair to say.
There's this sort of Western model of rational debate that says, well, you should strip all of your cares out. I'm quite anti that. I think we should surface our cares in a way which really shows people what's driving things and the decisions that people are making, because otherwise they just lurk in the background. So yes, I'm genuinely frustrated because this is hurting people. People are going through an education system where they're leaving with certificates which don't get them jobs, which they are increasingly paid for. They've paid for these. They've got an enormous debt now hung around their neck, and the 2-1 they got in art history isn't going to get them anything. And I think that's problematic. It really is. It really is a problem that needs solving. So yes, there's frustration. Is it going anywhere? Well, I don't know. It's always hard to say what's your idea and what contribution you've made. And I think people who obsess over the contribution that they have made to an industry are also slightly suspect. But here's a couple of things I've noticed. Resources, not courses.
Yeah.
So I didn't invent performance support. Don't know who did, but there are people like Guy Wallace and Bob Mosher and Nigel Harrison have been doing it a long time. So I didn't invent that, but the resources, not courses, is a particular turn of phrase and a particular nuance that I certainly did contribute. And I've started to see that coming back at me in conferences. People would be talking about it. The experience design obviously isn't something that I contributed, but the idea of applying that thinking within learning was something that I kind of drove very strongly at a time when I couldn't see anybody else doing it. And now we're starting to talk about that much more. So I think I've been a contributor to that. Design thinking and learning, again, other people have contributed to that, but I think we're starting to see people talk about that more, and even kind of little things that make me wonder. So I had a bit of a rant for a few years about learning and education are completely different things. Actually, education gets in the way of learning, and I talk about this in the book. And I noticed that Seth Godin is making the same argument. Now, I'm not assuming that that's necessarily something you got from me or somebody you got from somebody who got from me, but it's interesting that very peculiar and specific kind of point is sort of bubbled up in another area. But having said all that, my real frustration is that none of that really matters in a sense. The effective context is the thing that is at the heart of all this, which is driving that thinking, and almost nobody is really kind of talking about that or kind of tackling it in the way that one might like. So
The Learning Hack Podcast is brought to you by John Helmer Consulting. If you're a startup or scale-up looking to grow your business in learning technologies, we offer 20 years experience and all the creative and strategic support you need. To make a real impact with your marketing and thought leadership, visit johnhelmerconsulting.com today.
Do you think maybe feelings are a bit of it, feelings in general, the passions, emotion, all that area is a hot potato as far as business is concerned?
Yeah, absolutely. Because this is, a kind of Western model of thought goes back to Plato, that reason and emotion are separate, and business implicitly assumes that we should quite deliberately separate them out. People will say things like that in meetings. We need to set our emotions aside and so on, and because that's so deeply embedded in our way of thinking, it's almost impossible to talk about affective dimensions. I use the word affective because if we say emotion, everybody thinks it's something else.
Yeah.
In the way that we talk and think about things, because immediately there's such a world of kind of assumptions and convention that the conversation slides sideways. So business is very resistant. They think it's all emotions is the kind of soft and fluffy stuff. What they don't realise is research like I think it was Daniel Levine into Israeli judges making decisions found that these are primarily driven by emotional elements, and this is where it starts to look more kind of Kahneman in flavour, which is unless we actually understand that these processes are really what underpin what superficially is rational decision making, we'll never get any closer to really making good decisions or understanding why decisions are made.
I sort of feel within the sphere of marketing, particularly the agency side, I started my marketing career in an advertising agency, there is a language for talking about feelings. Sometimes quite a brutal language, but there is a language within that world for how we create effective experiences. Do you think maybe that's something that on the learning side we need to develop?
I love that. I think it's super insightful. So in case it's sounding a bit wishy-washy, marketing does sentiment analysis.
Yeah.
And sentiment analysis can be very powerful. Sentiment analysis can determine who wins an election. And if you think it's sort of like greed and all that kind of stuff, there's tremendous fine detail there. So Google, Amazon are mapping in frightening levels of detail what you care about as you click through, as your mouse hovers over one thing or another, because you know enough about what sparked people's interest or what excites them. You can sell them anything. You can determine what they do from 1 minute to the next. So quietly in the background, almost invisibly, they are mapping your sentimental map, if you like. They are understanding what you click on and what you don't, and when you click on those things minute by minute at different points of the day.
Another reflection on that would make, so a slight concern, looping back to something that we were talking about earlier really, is with some of those sentiment tools. I looked at something that is a plug-in to LinkedIn, which will kind of analyse analyse the style of people that you want to sell to on LinkedIn, and will tell you how to write emails to them. This is social selling for salespeople.
Yeah.
And I wondered why all the spam messages I was getting from people were immensely wordy and lengthy. And then I looked at my profile as put together by this program, and it said John is very verbose, and he likes kind of long form copy. If you write him an email, make sure it lasts for 2,000 words. But when I looked into the kind of model that they were using behind this AI-driven thing, actually it's kind of based on Myers-Briggs, which is, it's been a bit discredited. It doesn't have great science underpinning.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic. I'm glad you raised it, because there's sort of two ways in which that model can slide sideways. One is that it's got a faulty model, as you described, like Myers-Briggs baked into it. But the other is that we just use machine learning and we say, well, we're not going to do that. We just show it all the data, which a lot of people think is the right way to go. But you could show it all the recruitment data and it will start making decisions. And what you'll never realize, because the algorithms in machine learning aren't explicit, is that it has basically spotted the fact that you're biased in the way that you hire people like you, and it will begin to replicate that. And there are a number of people, Miles Runham is one of them, who are worried about that in all this excitement around machine learning, is that lurks, is that it will act to deepen and embed those biases and conventions unless it's actively corrected.
It's a really interesting debate, that. And I've also heard with kind of less advanced types of AI, for instance, there's been a lot of kind of AI monitoring of filtering out of CVs. Actually, before it got to that stage of machine learning, which basically uses the data of what people are already doing, when it was kind of rules-based, they found that they actually, HR people have reported that they got a more diverse recruitment effort, because nobody was going to be explicit about their biases when they set up the rules. So no one's going to say, I'd like to make sure that you only choose people who came from Oxford and Cambridge who are white and male.
No, but the problem is that I can't quite see the end of this, but I can see how it starts to play out. It's an AI war, isn't it? So I go on LinkedIn, and LinkedIn already does something like this. Well, you can pay some money, and it will optimize your keywords or whatever, your presentation of self, for the algorithms. In other words, you're paying one algorithm to second guess another algorithm. So, and that's just obvious. You would make money that way. So if you know that, because they will start to work this way, big algorithms are used for recruitment of these organisations. You come up with an algorithm which optimises your stuff for those algorithms, and you get people to pay, to be passed through that system, PARSED, in order to kind of be more successfully winning the jobs, and you'll be able to plot that. All the data will be there, and that just sucks, doesn't it? I mean, there's something deeply disturbing about that, and I just think, well, at some point we're going to have to decide this is where we need to get off and actually not do that if we want to avoid some kind of horrible conclusion of that process.
Innovations in your job title. What is innovation for you? How does it happen with the organisations or not? I'm very interested in that.
It's always a kind of a slightly painful process. People like this idea of embracing innovation. I think innovation is really something that you can embrace. It's always change. Change always brings about, kind of pain, for people who are attached to the convention. And organisations are built around those conventions. And so there's an organisational sense in which it's really difficult to do innovation. So you see big companies buying small, innovative organisations to try and, seed those ideas internally, and generally the culture just kind of kills them, because governance is generally there to stop innovation. I'm going to try and make it as explicit as possible, but the people who got into positions of governance are there because they spot and avoid risks, and innovation is all about taking risk. And I've been in this odd situation where I've had to present to people on why we want to do this innovative thing, and they've said, well, show us the business case. And you kind of think, well, the business case is I'm going to roll the dice, and there's a 1 in 6 chance that something interesting will happen here. But of course, then that's not acceptable. You have to demonstrate that it will return value, and so it all becomes a bit of kind of camouflage. So I think there are a whole load of sort of series of techniques around driving innovation, which are about keeping it small, so pilots are a good way, prototypes, pilots, using data to kind of demonstrate value. I think you have to build trust. I think you have to visualize things. So actually we found in some organizations it was much better to go in front of the HR director with something you were going to build mocked up on an iPad than it was going in front of a governance committee and try and present a kind of a lengthy business case, because they just pick holes in it. For the final thing I'll say on that is I think innovation is fundamentally linked to difference and diversity, and you have to build that into what you're doing in innovation, because those different perspectives are what will drive kind of innovation. And quite often it's the consensus that is kind of killing innovation. And so difference and diversity are, I absolutely believe this, at the very heart of what makes a progress in innovation.
Finally, just to wrap up, what's the hardest lesson you ever learned, and how did you learn it?
The hardest lesson, I think, is always the one that you don't see and everybody else does. And in kind of coaching people, you realise that they rise to a kind of a ceiling where there's some kind of lesson that for whatever reason they can't learn, and unless they learn that lesson, then they're not going to progress. And so I know, because I've seen it in other people, that surely that's the case with me, that there's something I'm just not getting that other people get, and so I need that feedback in order to kind of progress. But to answer your question more directly, one of the hardest lessons I think has been that it's not enough to figure things out. You have to sell. And I found that so difficult, because for so much of my life I thought what I was trying to do was figure things out, and that once I'd figure things out, then progress would be made. And what I've realised is that little catchy things like resources, not courses, well, it frustrates me that that's been picked up, and as you say, you start to see it. Why? Because it rhymes. Because you can put it on a bumper sticker.
Line with the internal rhyme.
And I find that almost kind of offensive, because it's so against kind of my personality, this idea that you have to kind of sell and popularise and commercialise and whatever stuff in order for it to be successful. But I think that is the lesson that I'm learning, I'm being forced to learn, which is that it's not enough to kind of figure things out. You have to sell those ideas if you want things to change.
You have to go on every single podcast that's going.
I love these podcasts. I love getting the chance to talk. And I love the fact that you're such a good listener.
Thank you.
But yes, there's an element of that. But it's more the simplification that I think irks me. It's like, well, you're not going to make any progress if you can't put it on a T-shirt.
Yeah.
And that I struggle a bit with.
That's all on the Learning Hack podcast for this time. Huge thanks to Nick Shackleton-Jones, our guest. The Learning Hack is completely independent of any vendor, company or body, so if you want to help us sustain it into the future, please make sure to like and subscribe and give us a 5-star rating on whatever platform you get your podcasts from, and you'll win a 5-star rating in our hearts. You can reach me at John Helmer on Twitter or through my website, johnhelmerconsulting.com. Next time on The Learning Hack, we have David Perring of Fosway talking about burning platforms. He told me his wife works in immunisation, which seems appropriate given that his enthusiasm and passion are completely infectious. Don't miss it. See you then, and until next time, bye-bye.
Now I finally get it.
So I hate the idea that I'd be kind of resources not courses guy, but I suspect that's many people already know me.
Perhaps after the book now you'll be the effective context guy.
It's not quite catchy, is it? That's the thing. It's not catchy enough. Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway.